3 minutes. That's all it took for a single palace confirmation to ignite headlines around the world and send shockwaves through royal watchers, critics, supporters, and skeptics alike. 3 minutes between silence and chaos. 3 minutes between carefully maintained calm and a story that refuses to stay contained. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry. Rushed. Private clinic. Medical emergency. Those words don't usually appear together. And when they do, they are almost never confirmed so plainly. So why now? Why this announcement? Why this wording? And why does it feel different? Because this time, the palace didn't deny. It didn't deflect. It didn't bury the story beneath vague phrases and distant reassurances. Instead, it confirmed something far more unsettling. That behind the titles, the press releases, the carefully curated images, something had gone very wrong. And that's where this story truly begins. Not at the clinic, not with flashing lights or hushed corridors, but with pressure, accumulated, compounding, unrelenting. Ask yourself this. How many public figures can carry years of scrutiny, family fractures, legal battles, media backlash, and global commentary without cracking? How many can relive the same traumas repeatedly, on television, in headlines, in comment sections, without consequence? Short answer? Not many. And yet, Prince Harry has spent years being expected to do exactly that. Smile through it. Explain himself. Defend himself. Relive it. Again, and again, and again. Here's what makes this moment impossible to ignore. The palace rarely confirms medical emergencies involving senior royals unless there is no alternative. History tells us that. When health issues arise, the language is softened. The timing is delayed. The story is filtered until it feels safe. So when a confirmation comes quickly, urgently, it suggests something else entirely. It suggests speed mattered. It suggests control was slipping. It suggests someone, somewhere, realized this could not wait. And that raises a disturbing question. What happened in the hours before that announcement? Because insiders and observers alike agree on one thing. This didn't come out of nowhere. For years now, Prince Harry has been publicly open about his mental health struggles. He spoke about grief, about anger, about therapy, about feeling trapped by expectations and haunted by loss. At first, those admissions were praised, applauded, framed as brave. But something shifted. Over time, openness became ammunition. Vulnerability became spectacle. Every word was dissected, doubted, debated. Was he being honest or strategic? Was he healing or selling pain? Imagine living inside that contradiction. Imagine being told to speak your truth, then punished for how often you do it. Imagine being encouraged to be vulnerable, then accused of weakness when that vulnerability doesn't resolve neatly. That tension doesn't disappear. It builds. And while the public moved on to the next controversy, the pressure didn't vanish with the headlines. It lingered, quietly, relentlessly, now at distance. Distance from family, distance from tradition, distance from the structures that once dictated every hour of his life. Some say freedom followed. Others say isolation did. Which version is closer to the truth? Only those inside the gates truly know, but even outsiders can recognize the signs of someone untethered. Someone without a fixed role. Someone trying to define themselves while being constantly told who they are supposed to be. And that's before we even talk about timing. Because this story didn't break during a quiet period. It didn't surface when nothing else was happening. It arrived amid ongoing tensions, legal questions, public criticism, and relentless online commentary. Every move scrutinized. Every silence interpreted. Every appearance analyzed for meaning. Ask yourself, how long can anyone live like that? Supporters argue Harry has been targeted unfairly, criticized for speaking up, punished for leaving, mocked for struggling. Critics argue he brought this on himself, that he chose exposure, that he monetized pain. Both narratives exist. And both can be true in parts. But neither negates one undeniable reality. Mental strain does not care who is right. It accumulates anyway. And when it reaches a breaking point, it rarely announces itself politely. That's why the phrase, rush to a private clinic, matters so much. Private clinics are chosen for discretion, for control, for distance from public spectacle. But rushing implies urgency, a loss of time, a loss of options. Which leads to another uncomfortable question. If everything was manageable, why the rush? Was there a moment when those around him realized this wasn't just stress? That this wasn't just exhaustion? That this wasn't something that could be talked through or postponed? We don't know the exact trigger. Not yet. But we do know something else. The palace did not wait days. It did not wait weeks. It acted. And that decision alone speaks volumes. Because behind every official statement is a series of conversations. Advisors weighing risks. Doctors assessing urgency. Communications teams calculating fallout. Someone had to decide this was better revealed than concealed. And that tells us this situation crossed a threshold. As the news spread, reactions were immediate and divided. Some expressed concern, genuine sympathy, worry that felt raw and personal. Others questioned the narrative, the timing, the phrasing, and some, inevitably, turned it into spectacle. That contrast, compassion versus skepticism, has followed Prince Harry for years. It's part of the environment he exists in, and it's impossible to believe it hasn't taken a toll. Which brings us to the most important point of all. This story isn't just about one medical emergency. It's about what happens when personal pain becomes public property. It's about what happens when a man is forever frozen between who he was, who he tried to escape, and who the world insists he remains. And it's about what happens when even a palace can no longer pretend everything is under control. Because here's the truth no headline can capture. Mental health crises rarely erupt in isolation. They are the culmination of ignored warnings, delayed conversations, and unresolved conflicts. And if that's the case here, if this moment represents the breaking point rather than the beginning, then the questions ahead are far more serious than the announcement itself. What warnings were missed? What pressures intensified behind closed doors? And who, exactly, was present when the situation escalated? And who was not? Because according to multiple whispers already circulating, the most revealing detail may not be where Prince Harry was taken, but who wasn't there when it happened. And that omission may change how this entire story is understood. Was it panic or protocol breaking down? That's the question no one outside the palace walls was supposed to ask. And yet, in the hours before Prince Harry was rushed to a private clinic, that question hung in the air like smoke after an unseen fire. Because according to multiple accounts, the chain of events didn't begin with sirens or doctors. It began with a call that wasn't scheduled, a call that didn't follow routine, a call that, once made, could not be taken back. And here's the unsettling part. That call wasn't meant to ripple outward. It wasn't meant to leak. It wasn't meant to become the first crack in a wall that had been holding for years. But it did. So let's rewind. Late evening. The kind of hour when public life quiets down, but private tensions often peak. When the day's distractions fade and whatever has been pushed aside comes rushing back in. For most people, that hour is forgettable. For Prince Harry, that night would become something else entirely. Sources close to the situation describe a noticeable shift earlier that day. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just off. Missed responses. Delayed check-ins. A tone in messages that felt heavier than usual. Nothing that would trigger alarms on its own. But when viewed together, it formed a pattern. And patterns matter. Because people don't unravel all at once. They fray. Slowly. Quietly. Invisibly. Those closest to Harry had seen stress before. They'd seen exhaustion. They'd seen frustration and anger and moments of visible strain. This wasn't new territory. So what made this different? One word keeps coming up. Urgency. Something about that evening suggested time was no longer on their side. Was it something he said? Something he didn't say? Or something that had been building for so long that the smallest moment finally tipped it over? No official record will tell us. And that silence is intentional. But what we do know is this. A call was placed to someone who was not usually contacted first. That alone raised eyebrows. Because when everything is fine, there is a chain. A hierarchy. A process. This call bypassed it. And when protocol is bypassed, it's usually because protocol feels too slow. Imagine being on the receiving end of that call. The pause before speaking. The weight in the voice. The unspoken understanding that this wasn't casual. Reports suggest the caller didn't dramatize, didn't exaggerate, didn't need to. Sometimes urgency speaks for itself. Within minutes, a second call followed. Then a third. People who hadn't spoken in weeks suddenly found themselves connected by the same concern, the same unease. And here's where the story takes a turn. Because not everyone reacted the same way. Some moved quickly. Some hesitated. Some questioned whether this was necessary. That split response may be one of the most revealing details of all. Ask yourself, when someone is truly in danger, there's usually no debate. So why was there hesitation? Was it denial? Fatigue? Or the dangerous belief that this, too, would pass? One insider described it as a moment of disbelief. Not because the situation seemed impossible, but because acknowledging it meant accepting something uncomfortable. That whatever support structures were in place weren't enough. And that realization carries consequences. As discussions unfolded, another factor complicated everything. Privacy. Prince Harry's life exists in a paradox. Every effort to protect his privacy is itself scrutinized. Every move to shield him becomes news. So decisions that might be straightforward for anyone else become fraught with calculation. Hospital or private clinic. Immediate action or delayed assessment. Silence or controlled disclosure. These aren't just medical questions. They're strategic ones. And strategy, when mixed with human crisis, often creates tension. At some point, a line was crossed. Accounts suggest Harry's state changed noticeably. Not violently, not theatrically, but in a way that alarmed those present. Disorientation, overwhelm, emotional flooding that couldn't be talked down. This is where the narrative often gets simplified by outsiders, where people imagine dramatic scenes or explosive breakdowns. But mental health crises don't always look like movies. Sometimes they look like withdrawal, sometimes like panic, sometimes like someone who simply can't keep holding everything together. And those moments are often the most dangerous, because they can be underestimated. That's when the word rushed enters the story. Not walked, not escorted, rushed. Speed implies fear. It implies urgency that overrides image. Arrangements were made quickly, too quickly for comfort, some say, which suggests something had shifted from concerning to critical. And here's another detail that hasn't been fully addressed. The choice of a private clinic wasn't just about privacy. It was about control. Control over information. Control over access. Control over who could see what and when. In royal contexts, private clinics are often reserved for situations where discretion is paramount. But discretion alone doesn't explain the speed. Speed suggests necessity. As transport was organized, another call reportedly went unanswered. That silence matters. Because in moments like these, who you reach and who you don't reveals everything. Some expected voices weren't immediately involved. Whether by choice, circumstance, or timing remains unclear. But absence, intentional or not, leaves a mark. By the time Harry arrived at the clinic, the decision had already been made. This would not stay private. Not entirely. Someone, somewhere, recognized that containment wasn't possible. That rumors would spread. That leaks would happen. That waiting would only make things worse. And so the palace prepared something rare. A confirmation. Not detailed. Not emotional. But unmistakable. A medical emergency. Those words carry weight. Legal weight. Historical weight. Emotional weight. They're chosen carefully. Used sparingly. Which is why their appearance stunned even seasoned royal watchers. Behind that confirmation was another conversation. One far more tense than the calls before it. How much to say? When to say it? And what saying it would unleash? Because once confirmed, the narrative escapes control. Support pours in. Criticism resurfaces. Old debates reignite. And for the person at the center of it all, none of that stops the internal storm. As night turned into early morning, the clinic remained quiet. No updates. No visuals. No reassuring statements. Just silence. And silence invites speculation. Was he stable? Was he sedated? Was he alone? No answers came. What did come, however, was a realization among those closest to the situation. This wasn't a moment that could be spun away. This wasn't fatigue or stress or burnout that could be explained in a sentence. This was a reckoning. Because if someone who has spoken so openly about mental health still reaches this point, what does that say about the pressure he's been under? And what does it say about the systems around him? As dawn approached, one staff member reportedly said something that would later circulate quietly among insiders. This didn't start tonight. That sentence changes everything. Because it reframes the emergency not as an isolated incident, but as the visible collapse of something that had been weakening for a long time. And if that's true, then the most important story isn't the rush to the clinic. It's what happened before the call was ever made. What signs were ignored? What warnings were minimized? And what moment should have been taken seriously, but wasn't? Because somewhere in the days leading up to that night, something shifted. A conversation. A realization. A breaking point that went unnoticed until it was too late. And when that truth begins to surface, it doesn't just raise questions about Prince Harry. It raises questions about everyone around him. Why would the palace choose silence and then suddenly speak? That contradiction sits at the heart of what happened next. Because after the rush, after the calls, after the doors of the private clinic closed behind Prince Harry, something else began unfolding. Quietly, deliberately, and with far more calculation than compassion ever admits to. This is the part of the story most people miss. Not the emergency, not the urgency, but the language. Because when institutions like the palace speak, every word is weighed. Every omission is intentional. And every phrase that survives the editing room carries a message meant for multiple audiences at once. So when the palace finally confirmed a medical emergency, the question wasn't just why now. It was why like this. Let's look at what wasn't said. There was no description of symptoms, no timeline for recovery, no reassurance wrapped in familiar phrases like resting comfortably or out of an abundance of caution. Instead, there was a stark confirmation. Clean, controlled, almost clinical, and that alone set off alarms. Royal statements are traditionally designed to calm, to slow speculation, to project stability even when stability is fraying. This one didn't. It acknowledged disruption without resolving it. And that's rare. Ask yourself this. When has the palace ever confirmed a crisis without immediately cushioning it? Usually, they soften. They contextualize. They buy time. Here, they didn't. Which suggests two possibilities. Either the situation was evolving too quickly to control, or withholding confirmation would have caused even greater damage. Neither option is comforting. No rigid calendar. No constant protocol. No ancestral weight pressing down every hour of the day. But then something subtle happens. The structure that once held you up, even when it felt suffocating, disappears. And without it, you're left to build something entirely new while the world watches and judges every attempt. For someone raised within layers of order and expectation, that kind of freedom can feel destabilizing. Because freedom without grounding isn't peace. It's exposure. Sources close to Harry have described long stretches where routines blurred. Days filled with activity, but lacking rhythm. Purpose replaced by projects, then projects replaced by pressure. And pressure doesn't care where you live. California sun doesn't dissolve internal storms. If anything, the contrast can make them sharper. Imagine waking up in a place marketed as paradise, while carrying unresolved grief, fractured identity, and the weight of constant scrutiny. The disconnect is brutal. You're expected to be grateful, expected to be happy, expected to prove the move was worth it. That expectation alone can become a trap, because admitting struggle feels like admitting failure. And failure, for someone already accused of missteps, feels unbearable. There were signs, moments when Harry seemed withdrawn in interviews, when enthusiasm felt rehearsed, when passion slipped into defensiveness. Not obvious, not headline-worthy, but noticeable to those who knew what to look for. Isolation isn't just about physical distance. It's about emotional disconnection. And emotional disconnection grows when trust erodes. Harry's relationship with the press had long been adversarial. But after leaving royal life, the dynamic shifted into something more volatile. Every attempt at privacy was interpreted as secrecy. Every explanation was interpreted as justification. There was no neutral ground. Supporters saw cruelty. Critics saw manipulation. And Harry was left navigating a landscape where every word risked becoming evidence for someone else's argument. That kind of environment discourages openness. Why speak when speaking becomes ammunition? So silence grows. And silence, ironically, deepens isolation. At the same time, distance from family weighed heavily, even if unspoken. Estrangement isn't a clean break. It's a constant background hum of unresolved emotion. Birthdays, milestones, moments when instinct says reach out. But reality says don't. Those moments accumulate. And while public narratives often frame family distance as empowerment, the private emotional cost is rarely acknowledged. For Harry, family wasn't just family. It was identity. Removing yourself from that system doesn't erase its imprint. It leaves a vacuum, and vacuums pull hard. Friends reportedly noticed shifts. Invitations declined. Energy levels inconsistent. A tendency to retreat inward rather than outward. Again, nothing dramatic. But isolation rarely is. It's a slow narrowing of the world. The irony is that during this period, Harry was speaking publicly about connection, compassion, and community. And perhaps that wasn't hypocrisy. Perhaps it was yearning. Sometimes people talk most about what they lack. Then came the digital layer. Social media commentary. Endless opinions. Algorithms amplifying extremes. Even without actively seeking it out, the noise seeps in. Criticism becomes ambient. Praise feels conditional. Silence feels judgmental. And in that environment, the mind doesn't rest. It scans. It anticipates. It defends, which is exhausting. Another factor rarely discussed is the burden of expectation placed on those closest to him. When someone becomes the emotional center of a narrative, relationships can skew. Partners become protectors. Friends become buffers. Every interaction carries weight. That dynamic can strain even the strongest bonds. Support turns into responsibility. Responsibility turns into pressure. And pressure, once again, accumulates. There were reportedly nights when sleep didn't come easily, when thoughts spiraled, when the future felt less like opportunity and more like obligation. What next? What if this fails? What if stepping away didn't fix anything? Those questions are terrifying when you've already burned bridges behind you. Isolation amplifies them, because there's no institutional safety net to fall back on. No familiar hierarchy to absorb impact. Every decision feels personal. Every setback feels final. And then there's the loneliness of being misunderstood. When you feel your intentions are constantly misread, you stop trying to clarify. You internalize. And internalization, over time, becomes a pressure cooker. One former associate described Harry during this period as carrying the weight of everyone's expectations with nowhere to set it down. That image is telling. Because weight needs relief. Without it, muscles strain. Bones crack. Minds fracture. Isolation also warps perception. Problems feel bigger. Options feel fewer. Hope feels conditional. Which is why moments that might otherwise be manageable begin to feel overwhelming. A negative headline. A legal setback. A critical comment. Individually, they're survivable. Collectively, they can tip someone over the edge. And when isolation is deep, reaching out feels harder, not easier. Who do you trust? Who won't leak? Who won't judge? Those questions don't have easy answers when your life is a public commodity. As this period stretched on, the distance between Harry's public persona and private experience reportedly widened. Smiling for appearances. Speaking with conviction. While internally, fatigue set in. Fatigue not just of body, but of identity. Who am I now, beyond reaction? That question haunted him. And when identity becomes uncertain, stability follows. The irony is painful. The move was meant to bring peace. Instead, it removed familiar anchors. The world expected transformation. What it didn't see was disorientation. Isolation doesn't mean absence of people. It means absence of grounding. And grounding is what keeps storms survivable. Without it, even a small shock can feel catastrophic. Which brings us back to the night everything escalated. Because isolation doesn't cause crisis on its own. It sets the stage. It weakens resilience. It erodes perspective. It magnifies triggers. So when something finally happened, something we'll explore more closely, it didn't land on solid ground. It landed on exhaustion, on loneliness, on a mind already stretched thin. And that's why the events that followed unfolded so quickly. Because when isolation reaches its peak, there's very little buffer left. No margin for error. No room for delay. The gates may have been closed. The walls may have been high. But inside, something was unraveling. And the night of the emergency wasn't just about a momentary collapse. It was the result of too much carried alone for too long. But here's the most unsettling part. Isolation didn't just shape the crisis. It shaped who was, and wasn't, there when it happened. And that absence would soon raise questions no one was ready to answer. Because when everything began to fall apart, the circle was smaller than anyone realized. And what that reveals about support, loyalty, and distance may be the most explosive detail yet. What happens when the noise never stops, even when you do? That's the question hovering over everything that came next. Because isolation may weaken resilience, but it's relentless judgment that keeps the wound open. And for Prince Harry, judgment didn't arrive in waves. It arrived as a constant hum, day and night, comment after comment, headline after headline. There was no off switch. This is the part of the story that's easiest to dismiss and most dangerous to underestimate. Because public scrutiny isn't just external. Over time, it becomes internalized. The voice of the crowd starts echoing inside your own head. At first, Harry fought it. He spoke out. He clarified. He corrected narratives he felt were unfair. He tried to reclaim his story from what he believed were distortions. But every response fueled another cycle. Every clarification became a new controversy. Every attempt to explain became proof, to someone, that he had something to hide. That's the trap of modern visibility. Silence looks guilty. Speech looks defensive. There is no winning move. And when someone lives inside that paradox long enough, it begins to shape how they see themselves. Ask yourself this. How would you feel if millions of strangers debated your mental health, your motives, your integrity, daily? Not occasionally. Not during crises. Every day? Even praise comes with conditions. Support is often tied to expectation. Sympathy is withdrawn the moment you step out of line. That kind of environment doesn't nurture healing. It accelerates breakdown. There were days when Harry reportedly avoided news entirely. Weeks when he refused to look at social media. Periods when he tried to block it all out. But avoidance only works for so long. Because the noise finds other ways in. Friends mention headlines in conversation. Lawyers reference public sentiment. Business partners worry about optics. Even silence becomes loud. And that constant awareness of being watched, judged, weighed, creates hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is exhausting. Your mind scans for threats even when none are present. You replay conversations. You second-guess decisions. You imagine how something will be interpreted before it even happens. That's not paranoia. That's survival in a hostile environment. Harry's critics often frame him as thin-skinned, as unable to handle criticism. But that framing ignores something crucial. Criticism isn't harmful because it exists. It's harmful when it becomes inescapable. There is a vast difference between occasional disapproval and constant character assassination. One challenges, the other corrodes. And in Harry's case, the criticism wasn't limited to actions. It targeted identity. His role as a son, as a husband, as a father, as a man. Every aspect of his life became fair game. That kind of scrutiny doesn't just hurt feelings. It destabilizes self-concept. When you're told repeatedly that you are selfish, manipulative, unstable, ungrateful, even if you intellectually reject those labels, they begin to seep in. The mind is not impermeable. And here's the cruel irony. Harry had spent years advocating for mental health awareness, urging people to seek help, to talk openly, to challenge stigma. Yet when he himself struggled, that vulnerability became ammunition. Practice what you preach, critics sneered. Maybe he's not as strong as he claims. That contradiction is brutal. It sends a dangerous message. Vulnerability is acceptable until it becomes inconvenient. And that message discourages people from seeking help precisely when they need it most. For Harry, the pressure wasn't just about public opinion. It was about legacy, about proving that leaving royal life wasn't a mistake. That speaking out had meaning, that the sacrifices were worth it. Every negative headline felt like evidence against that case. Every setback felt personal. That's a heavy burden to carry. And the louder the criticism grew, the harder it became to separate external judgment from internal truth. Friends noticed moments when Harry would fixate on particular narratives. Replay them. Analyze them. Try to understand how they took hold. Why did this story stick? Why did that comment resonate? Why was this interpretation so persistent? That kind of rumination is a warning sign. It suggests someone is trying to regain control in an environment where control is impossible. And control is something Harry had lost long ago. As a child, as a public figure, as a symbol, leaving the institution was supposed to restore autonomy. Instead, it replaced one form of scrutiny with another, less formal, but more chaotic. Royal protocol at least had boundaries. Public discourse does not. Anyone can say anything, at any time, without consequence. That unpredictability keeps the nervous system on edge. Add to that the rise of online cruelty. Not just criticism, cruelty, mockery, dehumanization, dismissal of pain as weakness or strategy. Those messages accumulate, even when you try not to see them. And when they align with your own worst fears, they hit harder. Harry has spoken publicly about his fear of history repeating itself, of loss, of harm. Living under constant judgment doesn't soothe those fears. It amplifies them. Every criticism becomes a potential threat. Every rumor becomes a possible spark. That's not a healthy mental state. And yet, many expect public figures to endure it indefinitely. There's a cultural myth that fame equals armor, that money, privilege, and status insulate people from psychological harm. But the truth is often the opposite. Visibility amplifies vulnerability. Because when your mistakes are public, your pain becomes spectacle, and spectacle strips away dignity. There were moments when Harry seemed to pull back from public engagement. Fewer appearances, more controlled messaging. Some interpreted that as retreat, others as manipulation. But it may have been something simpler. Self-preservation. When the environment becomes toxic, withdrawal is a natural response. But withdrawal comes with its own cost. It deepens isolation. It reduces support. It narrows perspective. And when criticism continues despite withdrawal, it can feel inescapable. That's when despair creeps in. Despair isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It whispers that nothing you do will change the narrative, that explanations are pointless, that effort is futile. And once despair takes hold, resilience weakens. The mind stops fighting. The body follows. This is why the idea that public criticism is just words is dangerously simplistic. Words shape reality. They shape self-image. They shape expectation. They shape behavior. And when those words are overwhelmingly negative, the impact is cumulative. By the time the emergency occurred, Harry wasn't just dealing with a single crisis. He was dealing with years of internalized judgment. Years of being told who he was, by people who had never met him. Years of defending choices that could never be fully explained. Years of carrying the burden of being a symbol in a polarized world. That burden doesn't disappear when you close your phone. It lives inside you. Which brings us to a contradiction that complicates this story even further. For all the criticism Harry faced, there was also immense sympathy. Messages of support. Expressions of concern. Genuine worry from people who felt connected to his journey. And that duality, being loved and hated simultaneously, creates its own strain. Because praise can feel conditional. Support can feel fragile. One misstep and it's gone. That uncertainty keeps you performing, keeps you vigilant, keeps you anxious. You're never just being. You're managing perception. And perception management is exhausting. As the pressure mounted, the margin for error shrank. Small stressors felt enormous. Minor setbacks felt catastrophic. That's how systems fail, not through one dramatic collapse, but through cumulative overload. The night of the emergency didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at the intersection of isolation and judgment, where loneliness met relentless scrutiny. And when those forces collide, the result is often crisis. But here's the part that should make everyone uncomfortable. If this level of pressure can push someone like Prince Harry to the brink, someone with resources, awareness, and access to care, what does that say about the millions of people living under similar scrutiny without those supports? It forces us to reconsider how casually we consume other people's pain, how quickly we judge, how eagerly we assign blame. Because behind every headline is a human nervous system trying to survive. And when that system is overwhelmed, it doesn't matter who you are. The body reacts, the mind breaks, and the consequences ripple outward. As the story continued to unfold, the focus began to shift, from the noise of public reaction to the silence of private response. Who reached out? Who stayed quiet? Who stepped forward? And who stepped back? Because when judgment is loud, support needs to be louder. And in the hours after the confirmation, some absences were impossible to ignore. Those absences would soon become the center of a new, more uncomfortable conversation. One that wasn't about headlines or critics, but about family and loyalty. And what happens when, at your lowest point, the people you expect to hear from don't call? Who shows up when everything is falling apart? And who doesn't? That question cuts deeper than any headline. Because when the noise fades, when the commentary pauses, when the doors close and the phones stop buzzing, What remains isn't public opinion. It's people, or the absence of them. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because family isn't measured by statements. It's measured by presence. And in the hours and days following Prince Harry's emergency, presence became a topic no one wanted to address directly, but everyone noticed. Let's be careful here. Not accusatory, not definitive, but honest about what was observed. When news broke that Harry had been rushed to a private clinic, there was an immediate assumption among many observers. Surely, lines of communication reopened instantly. Surely, concern transcended conflict. Surely, this was the moment when everything paused. That's what people expect in a crisis. Reality, however, is rarely that clean. Behind palace walls, relationships are layered with history, protocol, and unspoken boundaries. Communication doesn't flow the way it does in ordinary families. It moves through intermediaries, through channels, through considerations that have nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with consequence. And that complexity matters, because when an emergency happens, those layers don't disappear. They complicate everything. Sources familiar with royal dynamics suggest that initial reactions varied widely. Some expressed immediate concern. Some waited for clarity. Some reportedly hesitated, unsure of what role, if any, they were expected to play. Hesitation in a crisis is revealing, not because it means indifference, but because it suggests uncertainty. And uncertainty often comes from fractured relationships. Prince Harry's relationship with his family has been under strain for years. That's not speculation. That's been publicly acknowledged in various forms by multiple parties. Distance, disagreements, silences that stretched longer than anyone expected. And while public narratives tend to flatten those tensions into sides, right versus wrong, the truth is far messier. Family conflict doesn't vanish just because something serious happens. In fact, it often intensifies, because emergencies force unresolved issues to the surface. Who calls whom? Who has the authority to act? Who risks reopening wounds by reaching out? Those questions don't have easy answers when trust has been eroded. It's also important to remember that within royal structures, communication is rarely direct. Messages are filtered. Access is managed. Timing is controlled. That means absence doesn't always equal neglect. But perception still matters. And perceptions formed quickly. Observers noted the lack of visible familial response in the early hours. No immediate joint statements. No public gestures of unity. No symbolic acknowledgments. Again, not proof of anything, but noticeable. And when something is noticeable, people begin to fill in the blanks. That's human nature. Some argued that privacy was being respected. That restraint was intentional. That silence was the most dignified response. Others interpreted it differently. They saw distance, coldness, a continuation of estrangement, even in crisis. And both interpretations can coexist, because restraint can feel like respect or abandonment, depending on where you're standing. What complicates this further is Harry's unique position. He is both family and outsider, both insider and exile. That dual status creates ambiguity in moments of crisis. Is he treated like a private individual, or like a royal responsibility, or something in between? Those distinctions matter when decisions are being made quickly. Another layer adds to the complexity: history. History of media fallout. History of private moments becoming public controversies. History of outreach being interpreted or misinterpreted in ways that fuel conflict rather than resolve it. In that context, even well-intentioned gestures can feel risky. Reach out too publicly, and it looks performative. Reach out too privately, and it risks leaks. Don't reach out, and it looks callous. It's a no-win situation. And yet, emergencies often demand courage rather than calculation. That's why this moment struck such a nerve. Because many expected the crisis to override caution. They expected family to come first. And when that didn't visibly happen, at least not immediately, it left an emotional vacuum. Within that vacuum, speculation grew. Was communication happening quietly? Were messages being exchanged behind closed doors? Or was silence filling the space where connection once lived? No official answers were given. And that silence, intentional or not, spoke volumes. One insider described the atmosphere as careful, not comforting. That phrase is telling. Careful implies strategy. Comforting implies compassion. In ideal circumstances, you want both. But when relationships are fractured, they often compete. Another detail added fuel to the conversation. While institutional responses moved swiftly, clinic arrangements, statements, protocols, personal gestures appeared delayed. That contrast was striking. It suggested a system functioning efficiently, while human connection lagged behind. Again, not definitive, but emotionally resonant. For Harry, this distinction matters deeply. He has long spoken about feeling unsupported within systems that prioritized image over individual well-being. If that perception resurfaced during this crisis, whether accurate or not, the emotional impact would have been profound, because crises don't just test bodies. They test beliefs. Beliefs about who you can rely on. Beliefs about whether reconciliation is possible. Beliefs about whether you still matter to the people who shaped your life. Those questions are heavy, and they don't wait for recovery. They arrive in the quiet moments, in the pauses between assessments, in the stillness of clinic rooms, in the realization that some calls don't come. Support doesn't need to be public to be real, but absence is felt even when it's silent. Another factor complicates this chapter: expectations placed on certain family members. Some figures are seen as symbolic anchors. Their presence carries meaning beyond words. When those figures don't appear, physically or symbolically, people notice. And they ask why. Is it timing? Logistics? Choice? Each explanation carries a different emotional weight, and none fully erase the sense of distance. It's also worth acknowledging that family members themselves may have been grappling with uncertainty. Medical emergencies don't come with scripts. They come with fear, confusion, concern. Some may have been waiting for accurate information before acting. Others may have been advised to hold back. And yet, public perception doesn't account for those nuances. It responds to what's visible. And what was visible, initially, was restraint. That restraint became a mirror reflecting years of unresolved tension. Years of public disagreements layered atop private hurt. Years of silence punctuated by brief, painful attempts at communication. In that context, the emergency didn't reset the relationship. It exposed its fragility. Which leads us to a difficult realization. Crises don't heal fractures automatically. Sometimes, they reveal how deep those fractures run. And sometimes, they make clear how much distance has already been normalized. If that realization settled in for Harry during this period, the awareness that even at his lowest point, the lines remained complicated, the emotional impact would have been immense. Because hope for reconciliation often rests on moments like these. Moments when you expect everything else to fall away. When that doesn't happen, something inside shifts. Not explosively, quietly. And quiet shifts can be the most permanent. As days passed, information trickled out slowly. Institutional updates remained minimal. Personal responses remained private. And the public, watching closely, began to draw conclusions, fair or not. Some accused. Some defended. Some simply felt sad. Sad that a crisis couldn't bridge the gap. Sad that family divisions appeared stronger than urgency. Sad that a man who had already stepped away still seemed alone. Those emotions fed the narrative. And narratives shape reality. Which is why this chapter matters so much. Because it isn't just about who called whom. It's about what that moment revealed about the state of relationships long before the emergency. And about how difficult it is to repair distance once it becomes normalized. The emergency didn't create the fracture. It illuminated it. And illumination can be painful. But it can also force honesty. The question now is whether that honesty will lead to change. Or to further separation. Because as Harry's condition stabilized and attention shifted from immediate crisis to long-term implications, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a medical moment. It was a relational reckoning. And the decisions made and not made during this time will shape what comes next. But the most revealing developments didn't come from statements or silences. They came from what happened behind closed doors once the initial shock faded. Conversations that were postponed. Choices that were reconsidered, lines that may have been drawn or erased. Because when an emergency forces everyone to confront reality, the aftermath can be just as transformative as the crisis itself. And what unfolded next would challenge assumptions about loyalty, responsibility, and the true cost of distance in ways no one anticipated. But that part of the story begins with a moment few people saw. A decision made quietly, away from cameras, that would ripple outward in unexpected ways. And when that decision comes to light, it will change how this entire episode is understood. What if the breaking point wasn't loud at all, but frighteningly quiet? Because that's how the moment is described by those closest to the situation. Not as an explosion, not as chaos, but as a sudden, chilling stillness. The kind that tells you something has shifted in a way words can't fix. This is where the story turns. Not with shouting, not with headlines, but with a realization. According to multiple accounts, the final hours before Prince Harry was rushed to the clinic were marked by a change that unsettled everyone present. A change in energy, in responsiveness, in the way he seemed to occupy space. People often misunderstand what a mental breaking point looks like. They imagine panic attacks or dramatic scenes. But those who work in mental health will tell you the most dangerous moments often look deceptively calm. A person goes quiet, withdraws, stops engaging the way they usually do. And that's exactly what raised concern. Earlier that day, Harry had reportedly been preoccupied, distracted, his attention drifting in and out of conversations. Again, nothing alarming in isolation. But as the hours passed, the signs became harder to dismiss. Responses slowed. Eye contact wavered. There was a sense of him pulling inward. One source described it as like watching someone disappear in real time. That's not a phrase people use lightly. At some point, someone asked a simple question. A routine check-in. The kind meant to ground. The answer that came back didn't. It wasn't incoherent. It wasn't aggressive. It was final. The kind of answer that makes your stomach drop because it doesn't sound distressed. It sounds resigned. And resignation is often more alarming than panic. Because panic still wants relief. Resignation suggests surrender. That's when the tone in the room changed. What had been concern sharpened into fear. Those present reportedly exchanged looks, not dramatic, not whispered, but knowing. The kind of look that says, we can't handle this ourselves. This is where people often ask, what was the trigger? Was it a phone call? A piece of news? A conversation that went wrong? The truth may be far less cinematic. Sometimes the trigger isn't new at all. Sometimes it's the realization that nothing has changed, that the pain is still there, that the effort hasn't worked, that the future looks exactly like the past, only longer. That realization can be devastating, especially for someone who has spent years trying to outrun it. Sources suggest that earlier that day, Harry had been reflecting, not reacting, to recent events. Legal pressures, public narratives, family distance. Not one thing, all of it. Reflection, when paired with exhaustion, can become dangerous, because reflection turns inward, and inward can become a maze with no exits. At one point, someone reportedly suggested taking a break, getting air, changing the environment. Harry declined, not angrily, not defiantly, just declined. That refusal mattered, because when someone stops wanting relief, it signals something deeper. Another attempt followed, gentle, calm, grounded. Again, the response didn't reassure. This is when the word collapse becomes relevant, not as spectacle, but as function. Mental collapse isn't about falling apart visibly. It's about the mind losing its ability to regulate. Thoughts loop. Emotions flatten or overwhelm. Time loses meaning. In that state, reasoning doesn't work the way outsiders expect. That's when someone made the call. Not the first call of the night, but the one that changed everything. This time, the urgency was unmistakable. The message was simple. This is beyond us. What followed was a blur of logistics and restraint. Harry wasn't told everything immediately, not because people wanted to deceive him, but because escalation can worsen distress. Instead, decisions were made around him. Transport arranged, clinic contacted, privacy secured. And here's a detail that hasn't been widely discussed. At no point was this treated as optional. That matters, because it suggests those present believed waiting was riskier than acting. When professionals use the word emergency, they're not speculating. They're responding to indicators. And indicators were present. Harry reportedly became increasingly detached as preparations were made. Not resistant, not combative, detached. That's often misunderstood as calm. It isn't. Detachment is the nervous system's last defense when overwhelm peaks. It shuts down to survive. Those moments are fragile. Say the wrong thing, and trust fractures. Move too slowly, and risk increases. This is why the decision to rush wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. As transport arrived, Harry was informed of the plan. The explanation was measured, focused on care, on support. How did he respond? Not with protest, with acceptance. That, according to one source, was the most unsettling part, because acceptance can signal relief or resignation. And in that moment, no one could be sure which it was. The ride to the clinic was quiet. No phone calls, no messages. Just silence punctuated by brief check-ins. That silence carried weight. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything unspoken. Arriving at the clinic marked a threshold. From private struggle to medical oversight. From internal coping to external intervention. For someone like Harry, who has long emphasized agency and autonomy, that transition carries emotional complexity. It can feel like help. It can feel like failure. Often, it feels like both. The intake process was discreet but thorough. Observations made. Assessments initiated. Those present stepped back as professionals took over. And here's where the story takes another turn. Because once Harry was under care, the question shifted. Not what happened, but what happens now. Mental health emergencies don't end when the door closes. They open a new chapter. One filled with uncertainty. How long will this take? What support will be needed? What changes will have to be made? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what truths will surface when the noise finally quiets? Because crises strip away pretenses. They force honesty. And honesty can be disruptive. For Harry, the clinic wasn't just a place of stabilization. It was a pause. A forced stop in a life defined by motion. And in that pause, there is space, dangerous and necessary, for reckoning. Reckoning with exhaustion. With isolation. With the cost of constant defense. Those close to him reportedly understood something in that moment. Whatever comes next cannot look like what came before, because repeating the same patterns would lead back to the same place. That realization is sobering, and it extends beyond one individual. It touches relationships, strategies, public engagement, boundaries that were never clearly defined. This emergency didn't just interrupt a narrative. It challenged it. The narrative that strength means endurance. That openness guarantees healing. That escape equals peace. None of those assumptions held up under pressure. And as the first night at the clinic stretched on, another realization settled in. The hardest part wasn't the collapse. It was the aftermath. Because recovery isn't just about stabilizing the mind. It's about changing the conditions that led to collapse in the first place. And those conditions are deeply intertwined with public life, family dynamics, and identity itself. Which raises a question no one wanted to answer yet. What would have to give? The pace? The exposure? The expectations? Or relationships long assumed to be fixed? As professionals monitored Harry, conversations continued elsewhere. Quiet ones. Strategic ones. Conversations about optics, timelines, and communication. Because while the crisis was personal, the consequences were not. Institutions don't pause just because individuals do. And that tension, between healing and narrative, would soon come to the surface. Because even as Harry rested, the world kept watching, waiting, speculating. And what would emerge in the days that followed would reveal just how fragile the balance between care and control truly is. But the most revealing part of this story doesn't lie in the clinic itself. It lies in what changed once Harry was out of immediate danger. Because stabilization is only the beginning. And the choices made after that point would determine whether this was a turning point, or just another chapter in a cycle no one knows how to break. Why did speed suddenly matter more than secrecy? That's the question that surfaced the moment details began to circulate about where Prince Harry was taken and how quickly it happened. Because for someone whose life has been defined by layers of protection, protocol, and calculated discretion, urgency doesn't just happen by accident. It happens when delay is no longer an option. This is where the story sharpens. Because rushing a royal, especially one who has deliberately stepped outside the institution, to a private clinic is not a casual decision. It is a convergence of medical judgment, risk assessment, and reputational calculation. And all three were in play. Let's start with the most obvious question people asked. Why a private clinic? To the public, private clinics often signal privilege, discretion, and comfort. But in crisis contexts, they also signal something else entirely. Control. Control over access. Control over information. Control over environment. Private clinics offer what public hospitals cannot in high-profile cases: insulation from chaos, no crowded emergency rooms, no accidental witnesses with phones, no staff rotations that increase leak risk. But that benefit comes with a trade-off. Private clinics are usually chosen when time is tight and when predictability matters. Because once a patient enters a public system, variables multiply. And on that night, variables were the last thing anyone wanted. Sources suggest that once the decision to seek external care was made, the emphasis shifted immediately from deliberation to execution. No prolonged debate. No extended observation period. No, let's see how this goes. The language reportedly changed from concern to necessity. That shift is crucial because necessity implies risk, and risk, in medical contexts, is never invoked lightly. Especially not with someone whose every movement has consequences far beyond the clinical. Those involved knew one thing. If this went wrong, if something escalated while waiting, there would be no way to contain the fallout. Not ethically, not medically, not publicly. So speed became protection. The clinic itself had to meet several criteria: discreet but fully equipped, experienced with high-stress psychological emergencies, able to receive a patient without delay or exposure. Those clinics are rare, and securing access on short notice is not routine, which tells us something important. This wasn't a tentative decision. It was decisive. Once transport was arranged, the focus narrowed. Minimize stimulation. Reduce decision-making demands. Avoid confrontation or escalation. This isn't about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It's about preventing additional stressors at a moment when the nervous system is already overwhelmed. Mental health emergencies require a different kind of urgency than physical ones. There's no visible wound, no blood, no dramatic collapse. But the danger is real and often underestimated. Professionals look for indicators that suggest loss of self-regulation, disorientation, emotional flattening, statements that suggest hopelessness or detachment. When those indicators appear together, the window for intervention can be narrow. That's why waiting can be riskier than acting. One person familiar with the process described it this way: it wasn't about what might happen. It was about what couldn't be allowed to happen. That sentence explains everything. The ride to the clinic wasn't rushed in a chaotic sense. It was controlled, quiet, purposeful. The goal wasn't speed for spectacle. It was speed for stability. Once inside the clinic, the atmosphere shifted again, from urgency to assessment, from response to evaluation. And this is where assumptions often fall apart. People imagine private clinics as luxurious retreats. Soft lighting, calming music, immediate reassurance. The reality, in emergencies, is far more clinical. Initial intake focuses on risk. Is the patient oriented? Are they coherent? Are they at risk of harm to themselves or others? Comfort comes later. First comes containment. Harry was reportedly evaluated quickly and thoroughly. Not with alarm, but with seriousness. That distinction matters. Alarm suggests panic. Seriousness suggests professionalism. Those present understood that this wasn't about optics anymore. It was about preventing further deterioration. And here's the detail that quietly confirms the gravity of the situation. At no point was the possibility of simply sleeping it off entertained. That option is sometimes considered in less acute cases. Here it wasn't, which suggests clinicians saw indicators that warranted immediate oversight. Once assessments began, the circle around Harry narrowed. Access was limited. Information was compartmentalized. Decisions were deferred to professionals. That can feel jarring for someone used to advocating for themselves. But in crisis contexts, reduced autonomy can be protective. Still, the emotional impact shouldn't be minimized. Being rushed to care, especially for mental health, can trigger shame, fear, or a sense of loss, even when it's necessary. Especially for someone whose public identity is tied to resilience. This is where the psychological complexity deepens. Harry wasn't just confronting a crisis. He was confronting what that crisis symbolized. A limit. A boundary he couldn't push past with willpower alone. For someone accustomed to enduring, that realization can be destabilizing. And yet, it can also be clarifying. Because collapse often forces a question endurance never allows. What am I sacrificing to keep going? As the night progressed, the clinic maintained strict discretion. No visual confirmations. No updates. No informal reassurances. That silence was deliberate. In mental health emergencies, too much information too soon can invite misinterpretation. And misinterpretation can cause harm. But silence has consequences too. It feeds speculation. And speculation thrives in the absence of clarity. As whispers spread, people noticed something else. There were no images, no blurred photos, no leaked sightings. In a media environment where almost everything surfaces, that absence is striking. It suggests the perimeter held, which tells us coordination was tight. And coordination at that level only happens when the stakes are high. Inside the clinic, conversations began shifting toward next steps. Not discharge, not public statements. Next steps, observation periods, support frameworks, boundaries around engagement. Mental health emergencies don't resolve in hours. They initiate processes, and those processes require adjustment. That adjustment doesn't just apply to the individual. It applies to the environment around them. Which brings us to a crucial turning point. Because once immediate danger subsides, the hardest work begins. Work that can't be done in a clinic room alone. Work that requires confronting patterns. Patterns of exposure. Patterns of response. Patterns of self-expectation. Harry's emergency forced those patterns into focus. It demanded answers to questions that had been postponed for years. Can life continue at the same pace? Can engagement remain unchanged? Can pressure be managed, or must it be reduced? Those questions don't have simple answers. And they don't belong to doctors alone. They belong to everyone involved in shaping the conditions of his life. That includes advisors, media strategies, public commitments, and yes, family dynamics. Because recovery isn't just about healing an individual. It's about altering the ecosystem that contributed to collapse. That realization likely unsettled more than a few people. Because change is disruptive, and disruption threatens established narratives. As Harry rested under observation, decisions were being contemplated elsewhere. Some about timing, some about messaging, some about distance. Distance from what? From whom? That's where the story edges toward its next chapter. Because while the clinic stabilized the immediate crisis, it exposed a longer-term dilemma. How do you protect someone whose life has been built around visibility? And what happens if the answer involves stepping back, not temporarily, but fundamentally? That possibility loomed quietly as the first night passed. And when dawn came, it didn't bring resolution. It brought reckoning. Because stabilization is not recovery. It's preparation. Preparation for choices that can't be undone. And the most difficult of those choices hadn't been made yet. They were waiting.